Hello, everybody, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where we break down the commodities space for both new and experienced investors. My name is Jesse Day, and before we dive in today, standard disclaimer, nothing here is investing advice. Do your own due diligence. And today I'm very excited to welcome two guests to the program. It's the CEO of Forum Energy Metals, Richard Mazur, and the VP of Exploration, Dr. Rebecca Hunter. It's great to have you both on the show.
Great to be on, Jesse. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I wanted to get started with both of your origin stories, as I do with all new guests. So let's start with you, Richard. How did you first discover uranium and get involved in the uranium industry? And how did that journey lead you from discovering uranium to where you are today as the CEO of Forum Energy Metals?
Well, Jesse, we're going back in time here, big time. In the early 70s, I was a geology student in the University of Toronto. And in 1973, a thing called the Arab oil embargo happened, a geopolitical event that created a lot of concern globally about energy security. And all of a sudden, the next year in 1974, I was getting all kinds of job offers to look for uranium from German companies, Japanese companies, French companies that were all looking for uranium because they were building out their nuclear sector in the early 70s. After graduation, the oil companies, the big oil companies, joined the fray, and they started looking for uranium and coal, all other energy sources, and I got a job with a company called Pan Ocean Oil that was eventually taken over by Marathon Oil, another big U.S. oil company. But we had budgets in 1975 dollars of, $5 million, if you can imagine, to go and look for uranium. And many discoveries were made, like the Midwest discovery in the Athabasca, the Canoxy discovery of Dawn Lake. Rebecca can probably talk about more of those. But anyways, so after the recession of 1982 was a tough time. I mean, that was inflation and double-digit interest rates, and a lot of businesses were scaling back on exploration. So I decided to go and get an MBA during that time. Got my MBA and then started working in corporate development in the gold mining sector in the late 80s and 90s. And then I noticed uranium was starting to pick up in the early 2000s. And I said, hey, I know a little bit about uranium. So I started up Forum Energy, it was Forum Uranium at that time in 2004. And I specifically decided at that time there's only two places after, all the years I spent exploring for uranium back in the 70s and 80s. There's two places to look for uranium: the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan and the Thelon Basin in Nunavut. So I staked claims in those two areas of Canada, and we've been involved ever since, Jesse.
That's quite a story. I actually wasn't aware of the connection between oil companies exploring for uranium back at that time. So that's a nice little piece of history I'm sure people will find interesting. So how about yourself, Rebecca? How did you discover uranium, and then how did that journey lead you to becoming the VP of Exploration at Forum Energy Metals?
Okay, well, I sort of started kind of at the end of Rick's story there, at least where the start of Forum. So I started in 2005. That's when I graduated with my master's. And so I started with Cameco. And so I spent 11 years with Cameco, and I really started in that last cycle boom. So just at the very start, I had no idea. I was just an undergrad, but I kind of started when everything was ramping up in uranium there in the 2000s. And so I basically, early on, Cameco was exploring everywhere at that time. So they had the basin, but they were all over the world. They were in Australia. They were looking in Mongolia, and one of the other big aspects is they were looking in the Arctic, so in the Thelon Basin. And so that's where I started, as basically it was a very pioneering project. It started just prospecting and mapping, big land package, to eventually discovering 2 deposits there. And so I got the bug for exploration working in that environment and really taking a grassroots project to discovery. And so then I guess fast forward again, downturns happened. So the downturn after Fukushima. So I finished up a PhD. So I started a PhD, which was actually also on the Thelon. So the geology that I did all during that time, I basically wrapped it up into a pretty ambitious PhD program and completed that during the downturn. And then, of course, as Rick said, then he staked again in the Thelon. Actually, gold Cameco, during that downturn, Cameco let that ground go, and Forum jumped back on. And then I kind of got woven into that as well, because it's just an area that I really feel that, has a lot of potential. And I'm just really happy to be back in uranium and exploring again.
Great. Well, I definitely want to touch on that area, because Nunavut is not a place that I'm very familiar with when it comes to uranium. Everybody knows the Athabasca, so we'll definitely get to that later when we dive into Forum. But for now, we want to do something special, I think, right now, because I usually discuss the macro, the fundamentals, the recent news in the uranium sector. I've done that with so many guests. That's kind of been done ad nauseum. So I thought that we would bring something to the viewers that could provide some value. And Rick actually suggested this. I think it's a great idea. And that is diving into the different types of deposits and their pros and cons. And most importantly, I'd like to wrap it up with what they mean for investors, how investors can use that data to inform their decisions. So I want to start with the Athabasca Basin, which is one of the areas Forum is exploring in. And the main category of deposits there are unconformity style. So Rebecca, I'll turn to you on this one. Could you break down the main characteristics of this kind of deposit and how it's mined?
Yeah, so unconformity deposits, they're kind of broken into 2 different main subtypes. So there's the unconformity contact, the deposits that form at the unconformity contact, and then there's basement hosted. And so the overall context is you have these kind of older basins. They're called Precambrian basins. They're sandstone rich. And these deposits form either at that contact between that and older rocks or within the older rocks. They're very often related to big structures that have been like fault zones that have been reactivated. And I guess one of the distinguishing characteristics is their grade. And so the very significant grades come from these deposits. So usually over 1% and upwards to, 20%. Like that's mining grade, of course. So MacArthur and Cigar Lake are examples in the Athabasca where you have these incredible grades. And you also have incredible tons. So you get these multi-100 million pound deposits. And then when it comes to mining, so the mining can be a variety of ways. So open pits, if they're shallow enough. So a lot of uranium deposits on conformity style have been mined just by open pits. So that's like Rabbit Lake was an open pit. In the Thelon even, they proposed open pit developments. You have just kind of the regular blast hole kind of stoping, kind of regular conventional mining. And then I guess one of the other things with some of these big deposits in the Athabasca, they're extremely high grade. And so they've come up with other methods because you want to kind of eliminate the contact, like human contact with some of these deposits because they're so high grade. So MacArthur, they use the raise bore sort of methods where they actually drill through the ore body and then they collect it in this big chamber below with basically automated machinery. And Cigar Lake, of course, they because of the ground conditions are so unconsolidated, they actually go into the ore body chamber and they basically jet bore it out and they collect the slurry and bring it up. So it's actually quite complicated. It depends. It can be very simple pits, but it also can be these other methods as well. And I also would like to mention that there is some new technology that people are working with. So Denison is trying to develop actually ISR technology that can actually go underground and get the ore in that way.
Very interesting. And aside from the Athabasca Basin, is there any other areas of the world that are known for having unconformity style deposits, or is that unique to the basin?
No, so there's not many though. So the Athabasca Basin is by far the most prolific, but the MacArthur Basin in Australia, so kind of the northern part of Australia, is another big area. So that's where Ranger and Jabiluka and a number of other, smaller deposits are there. So very similar, except there's no sandstone. These are actually all basement hosted. And then, of course, the Thelon Basin is another major area that's very similar to the Athabasca Basin. And there's a few others throughout the world, but much more minor.
Great. Well, thanks for that information. Let's move on to conventional sandstone deposits. These are the kind of uranium deposits generally found in Niger, where Global Atomic, GovEx are operating at the moment. So, Rick, I'll turn to you now. What are the pros and cons of this deposit type, or the characteristics and how it's mined?
Yeah, well, they've been mining in Niger for over 50 years. Remember that 1970 boom when nuclear power was being developed around the world to the 440 reactors that we have today. The French were in there aggressively exploring for uranium in Niger. They've been mining there. It's Orano now is the mining company. It's gone through a couple of name changes, but the Somer mining complex and Cominac mining complexes in the Timirsoy Basin of Niger, which is a big sandstone basin, have been mined for like I said, 50 years. The open pit mine there at Arlit runs about 4 pounds per ton grade. It's mined by conventional open pit mining methods. Very large, big stripping of a fairly flat lying sandstone deposit that has those grades of uranium in it. The processing of that ore is by heap leach, just like in gold, heap leach gold deposits. So you've got open pit mining with a heap leach, acid leach kind of process facility on surface in the desert of Niger. Orano has will be developing the Imararan deposit, but they'll be going underground with that, and I believe, and then there's GovEx and Global Atomic, which are all developing new potential uranium ore bodies. But there's been a lot of mining in Niger for years, and it's a very prolific sandstone basin that has these what are called roll front deposits. Maybe Rebecca, you can just talk about roll front deposits a little bit, and we can get into the U.S. side of the sandstone deposits.
Sure, yeah. The geology there is just basically you have these much younger, so this is a kind of younger geology than the Proterozoic, like the Unconformity stuff. So Mesozoic, Cenozoic, it's a dinosaur time and younger. And you have these sandstone basins they need to have very good permeability, and they usually have to also have like areas of uplift around it, and the greater the uplift, the better. And so essentially you have fluids, oxygenated fluids that run through there. And because it's in these younger rocks, there's organic detritus, stuff like that, that's also incorporated in the sandstone. And that's where the uranium mineralization basically precipitates. And so that's why you need those younger basins, because you need organics. And you also just need a lot of fluid flow running through them.
So with these conventional sandstone deposits, are they known for being lower grade? I know that than the Athabasca, for example. I know that the majority of the uranium discovered in Niger is a lower grade than Athabasca. However, Global Atomic also recently discovered some Athabasca level grades there. So what is the range of grade of U3O8 there in those type of deposits?
Well, the open pit grades that are economically viable in Niger around 3-4 pounds per ton. The Kaminak or Komanik was about 8 pounds per ton, and they were mining that underground. Dasa is, I wouldn't call it an unconformity style deposit necessarily, but it is grading about 10 pounds per ton, or about 0.5% uranium, and that's being the proposal is to mine that by underground. But yeah, I mean, these roll front deposits where you get the fluids going through the sandstone and it's reducing and oxidizing, and you've got this roll front of uranium that's being deposited as the oxidizing fluids pick up uranium, and then they meet the reducing parts of the sandstone and develop these uranium deposits at the roll front. Anyways, they tend to be a lot lower grade than the unconformity style, for sure.
Right. So let's move on to in situ recovery. Rebecca, you mentioned that in the basin, Denison was going to be attempting in situ recovery, but Kazakhstan is the biggest uranium jurisdiction in the world in terms of the quantity of uranium produced, of course, Kazatomprom there, and they use in situ recovery for their deposits, and it's also widely used in the United States, as Rick also alluded to. So could you break down these type of deposits and how in situ recovery works?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, in situ recovery, essentially you've got these very permeable sandstones. And so essentially, instead of mining it, you can basically drill wells, and you drill a bunch of different types of ones. So ones that'll basically pump fluids down, and then they'll go through and basically leach the uranium out or dissolve it. And then you have recovery wells that then bring it up. So it's kind of this hydrodynamic system where you basically use that sort of leaching and then recovering it underground. So it's actually way less, intensive to actually making a footprint. And I think Rick can talk about this a bit more.
The Kazakhstan geologically is very unique. I think Rebecca can probably speak more towards that, but the Kazakh deposits are really low grade. They're like 400, 500 ppm, or 1 pound per ton on average. So it's just but in Kazakhstan, they're allowed to pump acid down into those zones, and that's something that you can't do in the United States due to environmental considerations. So in Kazakhstan, the fluids that are pumped down are acid, which tends to dissolve the uranium, and then the dissolved uranium-rich fluids are pumped back up to a surface facility to recover. But Kazakhstan itself is geologically very unique. Rebecca can talk to that. She's more familiar.
What I want to say there is that these sort of systems need to have, again, like I said, lots of uplift. They need to have big basins to basically trap all this fluid. And what's really important to know about the Kazakh area is that you have the Himalayas, like you have this huge mountain building event, and you have these huge basins, all fairly recent, sort of, geologically. And so it's just very unique that way. You've got so much uplift, you got big sandstone basins, you've got the right time in geological history where you have enough organics to trap. And so the roll fronts in Kazakhstan are just immense. And so they basically eclipse every other type of sandstone hosted sort of deposit in the world. at this time. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that they're a very special, extremely large roll front system.
Right. And of all the deposits we've discussed so far, which are the most difficult to mine or require the most amount of capital to bring into production? Rick, I'll throw that to you.
Well, that's a loaded question. It depends. It depends on the grade. It depends on the depth. It depends on metallurgical recoveries, all that sort of stuff. Those are all very important parameters for investors to realize, is that each deposit is unique. When I got formed Forum, I decided to go after the real high grade stuff in our own backyard, in the Athabasca Basin and the Thelon Basin, which is a geological equivalent, as Rebecca mentioned, to the Athabasca for unconformity style deposits. Really deep deposits in the Athabasca require a lot of capital. Very shallow deposits in the Athabasca don't require a lot of capital. There's open pit deposits and shallow open pit deposits, very small footprint in the Athabasca, like the McLean deposits, that didn't require a lot of capital. The deeper stuff sure does, for sure.
Right. Far too simple of a question on my end. There's so many factors and so many variables involved, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where investors have to be wary when.
Right. Well, yeah. What if you could maybe kind of give some actionable advice in terms of how an investor who's evaluating a uranium deposit might know, like, how is this going to be economic to mine? What are the factors they should be looking for?
So I just checked on this again, because I haven't really looked for a long time. But the International Atomic Energy Agency has a list of 600 deposits, uranium deposits in the world. And they've there's a lot of good research being done, and there's 15 deposit types that have uranium in them. But the reality is that there's only about 5 of those 15 that have proven to be economically viable, and that's the key thing. And I can get into those 5 here in a minute, but what drives me nuts is when someone says, we've got 700 million pounds of uranium in this shale, or this phosphate deposit or something. It drives me crazy, because, what are the odds of that being economically extracted? And one of the best analysts that's still on the street, David Talbot, I remember he's now with Red Cloud. Dave Talbot in 2007 said, "Forget pounds in the ground valuations. That's ridiculous." And I hope that in this cycle, people aren't sort of using that sort of valuation. You have to go through a fundamental analysis, of each of these deposits, and each one has its advantages and disadvantages. Uranium unconformity deposits, which are one of the 5, are very high grade. They have a really small footprint, because I think Rebecca can tell you that these things are small and really high grade, but they're tough to explore because they're so small. That's why I brought Rebecca on the team. So we need that kind of expertise, because the exploration for those is tough. Sandstone deposits, on the other hand, kind of low capital cost, but low grade, right? And whether that's by conventional open pit methods or by in situ leaching, Conventional open pits leave a really big footprint. I mean, the footprints in Niger are huge. I don't think, yeah. That's why ISR is being looked at in the United States, because you wouldn't want to be putting that kind of a large open pit footprint for uranium. But ISR, its disadvantages are these. We're talking about hydrogeology here, and there's a lot of things that affect the economics there, and things can get messed up pretty badly with the porosity and permeability of the sandstones, the fluid flows, and all that kind of stuff, clay in it, and all that. So you have to. The important thing there, which is leading me, I guess, to the final thing is you really got to rely on management. So US ISR things, you want to have good people that know what they're doing, like Paul Goranson at Encore, or the folks at UEC. Stuff. It's not easy. ISR, there's a lot of technical aspects to it. So management is really, an important thing, and for your investors to take a look at. And from an exploration standpoint, you look for teams with discoveries under their belt, and Rebecca's made 2 very significant discoveries in the Thelon Basin, and that's why Forum jumped in there and grabbed that ground from Cameco. Investors really have to look at each deposit individually. There's a lot of parameters: how deep it is, what the grade is, how big it is, because you want to have a significant mine life to a deposit to pay off the initial capital costs, things of that nature. The operating costs are obviously affected by a number of different parameters. Infrastructure, where roads and power, are they there? Are they readily available? Those things all factor into making good decisions on what to invest in. From our standpoint, we're a discovery story. So our goal in a very safe jurisdiction, that's another thing people have to look at, politics. You want to be in a politically safe jurisdiction like Canada. Can you permit? Can you develop if you explore? We think that where we are in the Thelon Basin in Canada has that kind of potential to develop a really big ore body.
Great. Well, let's shift focus to Forum Energy Metals now. And maybe for those who aren't familiar, Rick, you could give us an overview of the company.
We mentioned it earlier, 2004, we started as Forum Uranium. We've, over a period up until about 2016, we developed, we've got 9 exploration projects in the Athabasca Basin. We focused in the Athabasca at that time. We also did some exploration in the Thelon Basin during that time as well, on some ground right next door to Orano's Kigavik deposit. 2018, things got kind of tough in financing in the uranium business, if you can believe it, because literally 2 years later, everyone wanted uranium. So we started looking at other energy metals, copper and nickel deposits or prospects in Saskatchewan. And then we've we've got back into the uranium game in real earnest, as the need for net zero 2050 carbon has created a huge demand for nuclear energy. So we're back exploring in the Athabasca Basin, and as Rebecca mentioned earlier, I've kept my eye on the Thelon Basin over that 10-year period, and Cameco eventually had let the ground go, where Rebecca had made some very significant deposit discoveries, and I staked all that land up, and we're planning to get back in there and pick up where Cameco left off.
Great. Well, Rebecca, maybe you could fill us in on some of the details with the exploration going on in the Athabasca, and also touch on Nunavut as a uranium jurisdiction, because as I mentioned, I was completely unaware. So could you talk to us about your activities there as well, please?
Yeah, so in the Athabasca, we have several projects. We kind of focused kind of in the more either in the basement or kind of on the periphery of the Athabasca Basin. So one of our projects is, the Wollaston, that's 100%. Forum, we have a number of kind of joint venture partners and projects. And so with Fur Island, we're partnered with Orano. We've got Grease River project, we're with Traction Uranium, and we have a few like that. But yeah, so the Wollaston project was one that we drilled this winter. And so we're basically looking for, the classic unconformity sort of stuff, like following close to where Rabbit Lake is, looking for that sort of zone. And then in the Thelon, so that's basically the Thelon is just this underexplored Athabasca equivalent. And so it's up in, it basically straddles Nunavut and NWT. And essentially is the same size, very much the same sort of geology. There's slight differences, but overall the same. And then there is an economic, or a deposit anyway, a significant uranium deposits that are already there, and that's zoned by Orano. And so it's there's three main deposits. They total 133 million pounds at about 0.5%. So a fairly significant kind of basement hosted resource. And so essentially we have that ground. And when I was with Cameco, we were exploring that actively. And so that was where basically I was there, and we're trying to figure out, where are other deposits in this area. We know that uranium's there. We know that it has all the characteristics to host deposits, but essentially because it's just kind of fits and starts sort of exploration. It had like Rick was saying, in the 70s there was a big push, but then the energy crisis, or basically the big crash there in the early 80s, that it was all done. It started up again a little bit in the 90s, and that died. And so essentially it's just been very abbreviated exploration. And so it really hasn't had a chance to make the big discoveries. And so basically the analogy is what we have up there, like Okigavik, and then the sort of stuff we found is almost like going back in time, that we're, the Thelon Basin is like Rabbit, when Rabbit Lake was discovered back in the 70s. And there's so much more potential to find, MacArthur's and Cigar level type of deposits. It just hasn't had the focused exploration yet.
So you guys are not only exploring for uranium, but also copper, nickel, and cobalt, key metals for the green energy transition. So could you talk about your activities there? I know you've recently announced an agreement to acquire Rio Tinto's interest in the Janice Lake project. So maybe we can start there and you can talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. So we do have a variety of energy metal projects, but Janice Lake is it's our more flagship one. So yeah, it's a sedimentary copper clay, and it's in the Wollaston group. So it's actually kind of in the same rocks that the Athabasca deposits are in as well, but they're a little bit younger. And so, yeah, it's a really nice district kind of trend of sedimentary copper. And so we do have the project completely 100% now. So we're definitely excited about that. And, tons of potential. So there's kind of three main zones, and these are the same zones that Rio kind of focused on, and they're called Janice, Jansom, and Refuse. And anyways, really good grades, really good intersections. So, intersections upwards of like 50 meters kind of lenses, grading at 0.5%, sometimes a little better. So, pretty analogous to really good sedimentary copper that you'd see elsewhere. It's in a bit higher grade rocks, and they're kind of folded. So, the geology is a bit different, but, really exciting. And so we're really looking forward to getting back there and basically expanding the resource. They're basically open. Rio they were looking for like a big, the copper belt sort of, deposits, and these are a bit more complicated. So, but it's very much open, and we're looking forward to getting back in there and finding more.
Rio Tinto, we believe, exited exploration of that property prematurely. We think it has a ton of potential. And we're currently evaluating our options. There is a fully permitted exploration camp on site, complete with helicopter fuel and diesel fuel to continue drilling on the property. So we'll be discussing as a board if we want to attack that ourselves, or more likely, because I'm getting a lot of interest after PDAC, we may be able to attract a joint venture partner to take on that project.
Great. And maybe you could give us some insight into the team behind Forum and how you're leveraging their expertise. Obviously, yourself being the VP of Exploration, we've discussed your experience. Anybody else you'd like to mention that is helping out with the project?
Yeah, so we still have the past VP. So Ken Wheatley is still involved as kind of our chief geologist, and so we're really trying to leverage his experience in the Athabasca and go forward with that. We have a young geologist named Martin, so he's just starting, and he's just really hardworking, a really good young geologist to build into a more senior role. We're doing a lot of community engagement, so for a lot of our projects, it's really important. And so we have a consultant named Alita, and she's really been very key in all our Athabasca projects and getting all that together. As well as we've initiated Creative Fire out of Saskatoon, and so they're really helping us with the engagement strategy in Nunavut. So just because it's a really high profile project that we want to do right. So that's kind of our basic team at this time. Of course, Rick and myself.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Rick, is there anything else you wanted to mention before I let you go? Of course, I'll be putting links to the company website as well as social media, but is there anything else you wanted to add to the conversation that you think people should be paying attention to when it comes to Forum?
I think Rebecca's probably pretty much shown the technical aspects of who we are, what we are, and what we plan to achieve.
I think that's the main plug that I, like to get out there, and I think it's mainly to do with our Nunavut project, is that, we're really in there to find the monster. We know that these deposits are huge. They can be in the Athabasca Basin, and so that's my real goal. I tried to do that back when I was with Cameco, and we ran out of time because of how everything went, but I think the real exciting thing now is we're going to try to find the monster up there today, or in the next while.
Well, thank you both for joining me today. It was awesome. First time having two guests on the show, so super fun, and definitely hope to have you back on at some point to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.